Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm going to be looking at the economy under Elizabeth I. Now this is designed for A-level history as part of my series on the AQA unit 1C. So on the specification we have the section related to the big question, the overriding question: how did English society and economy change and with what effects? And in particular on this I'm looking at economic development, trade, exploration, colonisation, prosperity and depression. Now this links with a video I've done previously looking at the issue of society. Now, this is a really complex issue when looking at Tudor history, in particular because if we had the ability to travel back in time, and we went back and we interviewed Elizabeth and her ministers and we asked them about the economy as we would understand it today, then they wouldn't see it in the same way. They wouldn't link it direct to ideas of government policy, but we do see in this some real kind of key moments of government involvement. So the stuff that you would definitely use in a question on economy, but you could also use some of this in questions on government, because we're going to see things like development of the poor law, and also when you're looking at trade, obviously trade, exploration, colonisation all links in very strongly with foreign policy as well. To start off with, I'm going to look at trade. Well, probably the biggest but the often ignored element of trade in Tudor England was the issue of internal trade, and the value of internal trade far exceeded that of foreign trade. The single biggest development was the growth of shipping from Newcastle down to London with the movement of coal. Hence, ideas like the terms you might hear today about someone who's able to sell coals to Newcastle, meaning that they can persuade people of anything, because coal at this point it came from Newcastle and it travelled down the coast and went to London, and London was growing enormously, and this kind of internal trade started to play a really important role in the English economy. The traditional kind of centre of English international trade was with Antwerp in the Netherlands. But from the early 1550s, this trade has started to decline. Now, there were points, if we go further back, where 3/4 of English foreign trade was with Antwerp, with the cloth. And Cecil, understandably, wanted to end dependence on a single market. Strange idea of the English pulling out a European single market here. But an alternative trade needed to be developed to kind of replace this, and there was some attempts to do this with Emden in Germany. However, actually the major shift in cloth trade was to with Amsterdam, and that the trade with Amsterdam grew at the expense of the trade with Antwerp, and this was largely due to kind of areas of Spanish control in the Netherlands, and so the English having to avoid the areas controlled by the Spanish. Another area of growing trade we see is with Guinea in South America, and this is where we see the actions of the famous or infamous, depending how you want to look at it, English privateers. There are kind of three key expeditions that involve Hawkins, and these highly irritated the Spanish, and therefore, as I said, they link in very strongly with foreign policy, where we see this idea of the degree to which it is England's fault that we end up with a war between England and Spain. Hawkins is again also notorious as one of the figures at the beginning of the slave trade and English involvement in it. So Hawkins landed in 1562 in Guinea, captured slaves and sold them to the West Indies. We see a second expedition in 64, which agitated Philip II, and he gave a warning to the English about profiteering from their privateering. And this second expedition included investment from Dudley and also Elizabeth, who supplied the ships on the expedition, or some of the ships on the expedition, and charged a pretty penny to do so as well. Now, the third expedition was the one that attracted the most royal support, so there had been some successes with the early expeditions, but this is the one that went horribly wrong because the ships are blockaded in Mexico by the Spanish, and this showed that Elizabeth was willing to provoke Spain for the sake of profit. And in terms of just focusing on economy and trade, it shows the Elizabeth and her courtiers were aware of the value of foreign trade and how much money that could be made out of it. I mean, English role here is fairly limited. They're piggybacking on trying to exploit, trying to essentially steal trade and things from the Spanish, and the Spanish are understandably reacting rather angrily, rather than the English kind of setting up kind of genuine trade routes themselves. English privateering continued. So we see Drake capturing £40,000 worth of Spanish silver in Nombre de Dois, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, in Panama. We saw John Oxham attempt to recreate the same thing, but was arrested and hanged for his exploits. In 1577 to 1580, we see Drake's voyage around the world again, and he captured a cargo ship full of silver from the Spanish and returned profits of 4,000%. So, with the range between £400,000 and £600,000 in total profit. So from this we can see why the Spanish would be continually annoyed, and why Elizabeth would continue to support the likes of Drake and Hawkins, because when things worked they generated enormous amounts of money, and this was often something that Elizabeth was short of. The flooding of the English market with Spanish silver didn't always necessarily have wholly positive outcomes. So yes, it meant crown finances and the spending capacity of many wealthy people and many courtiers went up dramatically. But with the flooding of the market with Spanish silver, it also had a rather drastic impact on inflation, alongside a number of other things. There were many other areas of trade. It's kind of early on in the development of English as a trading naval power. It is quite notably behind two countries in this. One, we've seen Spain when it comes to the New World, but also one of the countries it struggles to compete with is the Dutch, and their trading kind of network is more successfully built at this stage than the English. So with Russia, we see attempts to establish new markets with a degree of success, though kind of in terms of overall economic impact, it was rather marginal. This is done through the Muscovy Company that was set up in 1555, and this incorporated trade with Russia, but it failed to compete with the Dutch, who were doing a kind of a better job at this point. We see with the Baltic, we see the Eastern Company set up in 1579, similar idea, this kind of incorporating trade with a particular area. Again, had some impact, but it was fairly limited. With Asia, we see the East India Company set up in 1600. Now, later in history, this is going to have an enormous impact, an incredibly important part of the British Empire, and what we'll see in later stages of history. But at this point, again, it was receiving less investment than the Dutch East India Company, and it made it difficult for it to compete. But we are seeing under Elizabeth here as kind of the foundations of what will build English wealth into the future. With the Ottoman Empire, we see the Levant Company set up in 1581, and it enjoyed some success in its attempts to trade with the Ottoman Empire. However, again, it failed to compete fully with the Dutch, who were trying to do the same. And so the English at this point is behind Spain in the New World, and then with much of the rest of Europe and the Ottomans is behind, and out into Asia is behind the Dutch. But there is a beginning of it, and this starts to see a wider variety of goods entering England. And again, this is the impact of this is largely limited to the landed wealthy classes. In terms of exploration and colonisation, the extension of trade to the mainland of North America, it kind of led to this idea of developing colonies. Now, obviously, we know later on that this will have a big impact, and we will have a series of English colonies in North America, and they will be under English rule for quite a time, and then things will go slightly wrong, and they'll gain their independence. Now, at this stage, the early attempts to build colonies were not successful, although the name of the key one that they were aiming for, Virginia, does go on later on to become a successful English colony, but at this point, it doesn't quite work out. So the idea originated with the entrepreneur and explorer Humphrey Gilbert. It was encouraged by others, and with this really important book, A Discourse of Western Planting in 1584, that's published, and its author and Gilbert then kind of link up with Gilbert's half-brother Francis Walsingham, who is a very significant member of Elizabeth's kind of inner circle. Through Sir Walter Raleigh, Walsingham presented the discourse to the Queen, and again she shows limited degree of excitement about it, but again the idea does move forward. So Raleigh gained support from a number of prominent investors, including Walsingham, and in 1585 was granted a patent from the Queen to colonise what we become known as Virginia. So it does have Elizabeth's success, does have Elizabeth's support. It doesn't, however, have much success. So two expeditions eventually made land on Roanoke Island, which you might have heard of in North Carolina. Unfortunately for Raleigh and his investors, and even more so for those poor settlers, it doesn't come to anything, and the settlers mysteriously disappear. And again, this is it's one of these great historical mysteries that there was some writing left on a tree, which has been connected to local tribes. There's been attempts to look into the DNA and stuff of the surviving population around to see if they can find any trace of these European settlers. There was no obvious grave. There was no obvious remains. There was no accounts of them appearing anywhere else. So there's lots of stories of them meeting grisly ends through local tribes, or through the Spanish, or them attempting to sail back to England and sinking somewhere. And there's lots of archaeological evidence and historical investigation going to it. I still don't think anybody's absolutely certain what happened to them, and so it remains one of those kind of really interesting things to spend a bit of time having a look at. Now, the failure of English colonisation was largely down to poor organisation, a degree of ill luck, and the reluctance by Elizabeth to give it a kind of high level of priority. She faced war with Spain, and successful colonisation, places like Virginia, had to wait until the reign of James I. So again, Elizabeth is at the beginning of something, and this is why often I feel Elizabeth sometimes is given kind of huge credit for stuff that comes later, because the beginnings of things like the East India Company, colonisation of North America, these things kind of start under Elizabeth, but I never feel that she manages to kind of fully exploit them. I'm not convinced she's ever 100% behind these ideas. Her kind of reaction to it, her support for it, is kind of lukewarm, but maybe that's understandable. These things are new, they're unproven, and so Elizabeth was a naturally cautious monarch, and so we may be expecting her to go whole hog on these things. It is probably a little too far. Further parts we've seen, this is Walsingham's support for attempts by John Davis and Martin Frobisher to discover the Northwest Passage. Now, the aim to exploit mineral resources in Labrador, which is in Canada, and Walsingham also encouraged Gilbert's exploration of Newfoundland. So again, we see Walsingham is hugely keen on the idea of exploration, Elizabeth less so. And there's an interesting aside on this, that Gilbert's voyage was actually largely financed by recusant Catholics, and one of the reasons why Walsingham, a very kind of fervent Protestant, was quite keen on this scheme was it showed the potential route to remove Catholics from England, because by encouraging them to go and settle somewhere else, therefore solving the problem of the divide in England, and relieving some of the stress and threat to Elizabeth. Ultimately, this didn't happen, and again, Elizabeth fails to show real enthusiasm or proper backing for this scheme, which lies largely in the hands of Walsingham. So, what of prosperity? So the spec talks about prosperity and depression. Well, how much prosperity was there? Well, there was, but it really depended on who you were. So land income rose, and landowners required a range of material possessions. So they benefited from Henry VIII and then Edward selling off the land taken from the dissolution of the monasteries that knocked down prices. The Tudor monarchs all the way through sell off crown lands, and we see a golden age of building at this point, and even more modest level society farmers benefited from the rise in agricultural prices. So essentially, if you were a landowner, as the prices of things went up, you benefited. The value of land went up, the value of your crops went up, the value of the meat from any animals that you kept went up, and so there were groups who did very well as prices rose very, very steeply during Elizabeth's reign. There's a debate about the relationship between trade and prosperity and depression, largely due to a kind of a lack of hard evidence. Some historians argue that trade under Elizabeth was buoyant, notably things like shipbuilding growing enormously, and again we see the beginning of England as a naval power. More pessimistic historians tend to emphasise the kind of desperate search for new markets, which we've looked at with all these different companies being set up to try and trade with all these different areas, to try and offset the decline of the cloth trade with Antwerp. But the impact of all these different trading companies being fairly marginal at this period. Ultimately, comparing kind of Elizabethan financial institutions against the counterparts in Europe, then the European ones are more sophisticated. So England here is not a leading force in trade. We see, again, you've got the Spanish with their exploits in the New World, you've got Italy with its banking, you've got the Dutch with its trade. All of these seem to be ahead to some degree of the English. Now, in terms of urban England, we see kind of a mixed picture. So some old established towns started to decline in the Elizabethan period, and notably Winchester and others. On the other hand, places such as York and Norwich saw notable growth and improvement. There was also development of some new towns in places like Manchester. And those towns, as they developed and the ones that grew, tended to have a broad range of manufacturing, all were unincorporated. In the south, we see this enormous growth of London, which is seen as having a detrimental impact on other towns nearby, but it benefited towns further away, notably Newcastle, with the internal trade and the coal from Newcastle travelling down the coast. And so you see this ripple effect from London, which is kind of all-encompassing around its area, but with some building internal trade links, and essentially the most important things for most of the different regions in England was establishing trade with London, and it was London largely that goods came in through as well, particularly luxury items. So the regional variations is a really big part of the story. It's clear from taxation records and other sources that the wealthiest part of the country was London in the southeast, closely followed by Norfolk and Suffolk, and then what's known as the inner west country, so counties such as Somerset, Gloucestershire, Wiltshire. The poorest part of the country was in the north and in the West Midlands, and again this tended to be reflected in income levels amongst different social groups. So that there's evidence of inventories of goods left by labourers in Hertfordshire, for example, suggested the goods they left were worth almost 3 times as much as the goods left by their counterparts in northern England. So in this context, therefore, perhaps it's a little wonder that the depression, when it hits in the 1590s, has a much harder, much more damaging effect in the north of England than it does in areas such as the southeast. Again, some of these areas, notably places like Norfolk, are probably more associated with trade, and again they would have ebbs and flows depending on how the cloth trade was doing at particular points in time, and trade with the Netherlands. There was a growing gap between rich and poor. This was largely down to increasing price of food and the value of land. The landed classes saw their standard of living generally increase, though there were exceptions, and the less well-off saw their standard of living decrease, because if you produce the food or you own the land on which the food is produced, then as the price of food goes up dramatically, you make a lot more money. If you're having to buy the food, then that can have then your income will struggle, and the incomes did struggle to keep up. The costs go up dramatically. It has a very negative impact to standard of living, something that I'm sure we can all relate to in the modern day when we see high inflation and that eating away at people's standard of living. In Tudor England, it was very much like this, more drastically so, where runaway price increases were eroding the standard of living to a really, really extreme extent amongst a lot of the poor. Elizabeth's reign was a time of relative peace and stability, which saw the nobility and gentry building impressive homes, and we saw new developments such as glass in windows. And again, so there were people who were showing degrees of wealth not seen before, and we were also seeing develop a kind of trade and industry in a way that was different from what had happened before. But we're definitely at a kind of pre-industrial stage at this point. So in that way, and one of the remarkable things in linking it with society is maybe the lack of social disorder at this point in time, as this kind of clear divide where part of society was getting better off and the other part of society was getting worse off. It's maybe surprising there wasn't more social disorder. There was definitively impact of depression. So for many, real wages fell, and this was a particular problem when harvests failed. 9 of the 44 harvests in Elizabeth's reign could be described as poor. From 1594 to 97, there were 4 consecutive bad harvests, which made life kind of catastrophically bad for a lot of people in England. So there were kind of there was a real collapse in real wages, and they fell back to an equivalent had there been 9 years earlier, and conditions in the far north were so bad that there were reports of outbreaks of starvation, even some reports of extreme cases such as cannibalism in some places where there simply was nothing to eat. So we see a kind of really stark picture in being painted by some of the stuff going on here. So why was there such extreme poverty? Well, part of it we've seen it comes down to poor harvests. Part of this, and I often find this a bit contradictory, quite difficult to explain. One of the things that was happening at this point in time was the population was absolutely exploding. So the population grew by 43% between 1550 and 1600. And essentially what seems to have happened is the population exceeded food supply, leading to increased prices, a fall in real wages and increased poverty. So there's not enough food for the number of mouths, so the price of food goes up. There are more people in society, so there's more competition for jobs, and that means that wages, although they were going up, aren't keeping rate. So some of this actually, you go, well, actually, if your population is exploding, then the economy of it can't be that bad, because that suggests that the health of people is improving. So we see increased rates of fertility, which again suggests things like diet and living conditions maybe weren't that bad. But what this did then led to was family income being stretched. and wages being inadequate to support all these extra mouths. The increase in population was most evident in the towns, and then this led to outbreaks of epidemic due to overcrowding, and sometimes this would lead to the death of breadwinners, and this therefore would result in much more grave problems of poverty. And the Elizabethan era was again a bit of a golden period for low mortality. So the number of old people started to increase, and again can be seen as a good thing. So if people are living longer, birth rates up, you kind of go, well, maybe this is a sign England's doing really well at this point economically and socially. But the downside of that is that what you ended up with was more dependency. So it's not only have you got more children, you've also got elderly relatives to look after as well. And this put a real strain on wages, and add on to that a shortage of food, and it caused some real problems. So it might be actually that the English population was growing a little bit too quickly for what could be coped with the level of farming and things at the time. And farming was developing and changing. We've seen things like enclosure, and that's been an on-running problem through not only the Elizabethan period but the early Tudor time as well. So there were trade issues. So debasement of the coinage had led to a significant fall in both confidence in the cloth trade and a fall in real wages for those who worked in it. And this led to unemployment and poverty in areas where the cloth industry had previously been a significant employer. Poverty could be also be a problem of supply, and this was again in the 1590s partly a result of English wheat being sold overseas, and this led to an increase in prices again. And then we see things like infrastructure problems. So in the northwest, there was difficulty in actually distributing food, and so you would get regional kind of blockages and some real suffering in areas where the food wasn't getting to. Again, somewhere suffered at difficulty time for the cloth trade. So Norwich, for example, it was recorded about 25% of the population in 1570 was suffering from poverty, and they had no kind of no real complete answer to this, but there was an understanding of what would happen. So we're starting to see this connection where they started people go, well, actually, suddenly there's all these people unemployed and they've not got any money. Well, why have they not got any money? Well, it's because there's been a dip in the cloth trade. They haven't done anything wrong. And so there was an understanding of that, and there was an ability to relieve poverty in places like Norwich to some extent, and also acknowledge why it had happened. We see, as already mentioned, the collapse of the trading part with Antwerp in the 1550s, 60s, and 70s, and this kind of deprived England of much of the revenue it was needed. And we've seen how there was an attempt to kind of work around it. There was a continued use of trading monopolies, which made the rich even richer, but could push up prices, so make the poor even poorer. So if you have sole control over the import or export of a particular good, then essentially you can ask whatever price you want. One of the monopolies did cause a lot of anger, and again we see this. One of the best examples, I think, is that the Earl of Essex had the monopoly on the import of sweet wine, and when this was taken off at him after his disgrace, this was one of the things that essentially bankrupted him. But it was one of the areas that people resented because it made people were paying artificially high prices. So again, I'm sure in the context of what we're seeing at this very moment, you can understand the idea of a resentment amongst people in general as particular people or organisations are artificially keeping the prices of things high. Another cause of inflation I've already mentioned was that the increased circulation of silver, not only in England but throughout Europe, and this essentially starts to reduce the value of currency. So silver is now far less scarce than it was, and therefore silver isn't worth as much. And since at this point currency had an inherent value in that they were made out of a precious metal, as the value of silver drops, the value of your money drops, therefore the cost of other goods goes up. And this was made worse by the fact that the coins in England had been debased in the 1540s in order to pay for wars. And so we see this incredible rate of inflation across the 16th century for a range of different things at around 400%, and prices have kind of already doubled between 1500 and 1550. So inflation is a significant issue that really damages the standard of living amongst the English people during Elizabeth's reign. Agricultural change, again, I think in some places this was a really big issue. There is an argument that maybe we talk too much about things like enclosure, and maybe that their impact have been exaggerated to an extent. Now, the movement for enclosure did lead to depopulation in some areas. The movement of young men in particular to towns and cities, where they became very wage dependent because they're not working on the land, so they're not growing their own food. So as food prices go up, then they're working in towns and cities in jobs, and they're reliant on the wage. If that wage doesn't come out of food, they do this. This can lead to big problems. It leads to underemployment, led to poverty. And this then led to, in a lot of Elizabethan towns, it led to vagrancy. We also see it throughout England. Those who relied on the common land, if the common land is enclosed, then the people who are kind of living on the margins, so they've got just about enough to sustain themselves with the work that they do either on the land or elsewhere, plus the use of the common land to make sure they can pull a living out of it. If the common land is enclosed or access to it is restricted, then that can push them into a downward spiral and into the depths of poverty. There are several disastrous harvests, as we meant, and we see this particularly in England before Elizabeth became Queen. So it's horrendous. The worst ever harvest had been under Mary. But again, we see this particularly bad in the 1590s, and this coincides with an outbreak of the plague, and the famine pushed prices really high. There is, again, as I said, there's an argument that the stuff on the growth of agricultural change has been exaggerated. So between 1500 and 1600, the amount of land enclosed only increased by about 2%. At the end of Elizabeth's reign, the total land enclosed, even in the worst affected areas by it, was still as low as 9%, or below 9%. And again, one thing maybe we forget is that enclosure was actually used to increase the efficiency of farming. But we see arable farming improving this point. Farming of things like corn became more profitable than sheep farming and farming for wool. Now we see changes in farming again that cause problems. So things like rack renting, where we see landowners realizing that they can charge a lot more rent, and so the spiraling rent costs, or evicting tenants who couldn't afford to pay them more to put more tenants who could afford to pay them in, and again, so here we see this growing gap between the rich and the poor as the landowners are essentially profiteering over the increased prices, and the tenant farmers are the ones who are suffering. Attitudes to poverty are interesting at this time, and essentially the Tudors kind of viewed the poor in two groups. The first are known as the impotent poor, often referred to as the deserving poor, and the second are the idle poor, often referred to as the undeserving poor. So if you remember the impotent poor, then you are essentially recognised as not being able to provide for yourself because you are either too young, too old, or too ill. So you are not blamed for your situation. So if you are, I don't know, an orphan, a widow, an elderly person, someone who is disabled or ill, then the population and the government will be sympathetic to you and this type of poor, and believe they deserved help. Now, obviously, earlier in the Tudor period, that help had been provided through organisations such as monasteries, which are no longer there, and so something new is going to have to be done. The group of poor which got far harsher treatment were the idle poor or undeserving poor, who were seen as being of working age and fit. Now, the fact that then they weren't working was assumed at the time to mean that they were lazy, too lazy to find work, too lazy to work, and happy to live off begging and petty crime. Now, obviously, we'd look at this from a modern point of view and say, well, there probably just wasn't any work. There'd been a collapse of the cloth trade. Local farms had been enclosed, and so people had no choice but to turn to begging and petty crime. But the authorities saw these people as a threat, and we see a degree of kind of panic about increased levels of vagrancy and begging. And these kind of poor were often characterized as being immoral and criminal, and would be harshly treated and driven out of town. Now, there were local measures to try and help with poverty. So we see town councils, for example, in Norwich, that introduced experimental measures to try and deal with poverty. Alms were collected for the poor, which was a religious practice. A census was carried out to make a register of the poor, so they knew who was poor, who needed help. Work was provided for the unemployed in the workhouse. Rules were brought in to try and prevent begging. So it's kind of like, well, we don't want you begging on the street, we want you to go into the workhouse, and so on. And so there were measures brought in place. In London, we see the setting up of a series of hospitals to specialise in looking after particular groups. So we see St Bartholomew's for the sick, St Thomas's for the elderly, Christ Hospital for orphans, and Bethlehem Hospital for the insane. Now, again, so there we see real action in London, but it's action for the impotent poor, for the deserving poor. We see in the series of national measures also set up as well in the form of poor laws. Now, if people refused to make contributions, they could be taken to court following the Poor Law of 1563. But on the other hand, the idle poor could be whipped and fined if they begged without a licence. So again, they're trying to raise money to help the poor, but they aren't necessarily treating all of the poor particularly well. In 1572, we see the Poor Law, which made a distinction between the deserving and idle poor again. Contributions to poor relief became compulsory. Overseers of the poor relief were appointed by parish, and they would organise the poor relief locally. And again, the other side of this, the punishment for vagrancy increased, and vagrants would be whipped, and they would have a hole bored in their ear for first offence. And this meant that if a vagrant moved into your village or town, then it would be very clear to everybody very quickly that this person was a vagrant, because there would be a hole in their ear. And then any further offences would lead to criminal charges, and you could tell the person had had their first offence because you could see the hole in their ear. In 1576, we see another poor law. We see the houses of correction were set up to punish those who refused to work. So again, we see the undeserving poor being kind of seen as punishable, that they were clearly lazy. But we do see a degree of help. So a justice of the peace were required to buy raw materials and provide work for those who were able. And again, we're starting to see this growing complaint. It's like, you're lazy, you won't work. So just give me a job, I'll happily work. And so we see that kind of conflicting ideas at this point in time, which is, I think, continued when it comes to aspects of government intervention and poverty ever since, to some extent. By the 1590s, the English economy was definitively very weak. Poverty was a major problem. We'd seen years of war with Spain. They've been very expensive. We see a series of really bad harvests. So as a result, food prices are at an all-time high. We are actually seeing people in England starving to death. We see food riots in London and the southeast in 1595. And so again, there were further attempts to do something about this. So the Poor Law of 1597 set up powers of overseers that were clearly defined, including finding work for the able poor. And so some of this is about maybe growing sympathy for the poor and seeing the extent of it. Some of it might be about social control, where the authorities are going, well, actually, if we have large numbers of able-bodied poor unable to work, then this causes problems. So tools were provided for those who could work. Each county had to have at least one house of correction for persistent beggars. So it was trying to, those who could get into work, those who wouldn't or couldn't get into work might well end up in a house of correction. And we see everything kind of tied together right towards the end of Elizabeth's reign in the 1601 Act for the Relief of the Poor, where all these earlier measures were kind of brought together and reissued with some amendments. The impact of the Acts of Parliament was limited. More help was provided through charitable giving and for poor relief than through the compulsory levels that were being set. On the other hand, there was no major rebellions, popular rebellions at this point. Obviously, we see the Tyrone Rebellion, we see the Essex Rebellion, but we don't see large socio-economically motivated rebellions taking place in England. The food riots were limited in scale. So, by standards of the time, Tudor society was ultimately rather stable, and that suggests there was a degree of success in running the economy at this point. The extent to which it was managed, I think, is debatable, and clearly in all these areas, there's two sides to the argument. There's definitively kind of a theme I think runs through it, which is Elizabeth and her government could have done more. That is to say, not to say that they did nothing. They did encourage trade to an extent. They did encourage colonisation and exploration to an extent. They did do things to help the poor to an extent. Now, none of this works perfectly, and undoubtedly the economy is pretty ropey towards the end of Elizabeth's reign. Is it completely Elizabeth's fault, however? Well, although people at the time possibly did, I don't think we can go back and blame her for poor harvests. She is good at keeping costs down, so the impact of things like the war with Spain could have been even worse, and she did mitigate against that to an extent. She could have generated more money. They could have done a better job of doing what Mary did and keeping on top of renewing things like the Book of Rates. They could have worked better on revenue and things like that. But overall, really, you kind of go, well, there isn't complete social and economic disaster, although the economy does badly and people do suffer. So it is a mixed bag, I think, under Elizabeth. I hope that's been of some use to you. Again, and I know lots of people will be using videos like this as part of their revision, so again, I hope it's helpful in that. Just to draw your attention that there is a whole series of videos covering the whole of the Tudor period in a playlist on my channel, so if this one's been helpful for you, do go subscribe, find the Tudor playlist, and you can work your way through all the way from Henry VII through Henry VIII, Edward and Mary, and through Elizabeth as well. And also there's loads of other topics on there, history topics, there's loads and loads of stuff for politics as well. So hopefully it'll be well worth you subscribing, you'll find something useful. Thank you very much for watching.